Jesus had done. Decapolis is a large city. It comes from the Greek word deca, which means 10. So it's a strand of 10 cities. I believe it was east of the Jordan. So instead of just going home to little old Berea, Balling County, just telling his 1 and 2 neighbors that were gathered there in Jesus' name, to all of what God had did for him. Instead, he goes downtown to Tower City and gets on a bullhorn and says, "Look what the Lord has done. This man, he did it. I tell you, you can't fool me." And Jesus says, "Can you feel him?" But why, Jesus? Why? Why? I thought last time I checked, God liked to be praised. He liked to be glorified. He liked that his name was lifted up. So again, we have an instance. The story is moving one way. And the characters go in the opposite direction. We're moving one way. And they go the opposite. He says, "Go this way, go home, don't tell them." They go this way and tell everybody. Looks like he can't win. Let's keep going. Let's go to chapter 7. Are you with me still? Now remember, what do we know? Jesus is? But the people in the story don't know that yet. Chapter 7. Verse 31. Just want to highlight a couple more things. Again, he went out from the region of Tyre and came through Sidon of the Sea of Galilee within the region of Decapolis. They brought to him one who was deaf and spoke with difficulty, and they implored him to lay hands on him. Jesus took him aside from the crowd, again, aside from the crowd, by himself, not wanting a big show and spectacle yet, and put his fingers into his ears, and after spitting, he touched his tongue with saliva. And looking up to heaven with a deep sigh, he said to him, "Ephphatha," that is, "be open." And his ears were open, and the impediment of his tongue was removed, and he began speaking plainly. And he gave him orders not to tell anyone. Who can guess what happened? Verse 37. But the more he ordered them, the more widely they continued to proclaim it. They were utterly astonished, saying, "He has done all things well. He even makes the deaf to hear and the mute to speak. He's made all things well. He can heal. He can do this. He can make people with impediments speak. He can do all these things." But no one said, "He's the Son of God." No, sir. Still didn't come out of their mouth. They still don't know. They're getting close, but they still don't know. He touched the man and said, "Ephphatha," which means "be open," and his ears could hear. That is an Aramaic word. Mark wrote his gospel in Greek. So in the middle of a Greek text, Jesus says a word in a different language, then the man could be here. Then the man could hear. I don't want to mess with anybody's theology, but let's make a side note right here. Sometimes you have to speak in a different language to hear from God clearly. I'm not coming with apostolic theology. I'm not doing it. I'm not saying you have to speak it. I'm not saying it, but I'm saying sometimes to be able to hear the voice of God clearly, you have to speak in another language. Back to your regularly scheduled programming. We'll talk about that more next time. Let's go on to chapter 8. Verse 22. Are y'all with me? We still know he's the Son of God. No one else knows yet. Sadly, the demons do what we do. They still don't know. Chapter 8. Verse 22. And they came to Bethsaida, and they brought a blind man to Jesus and implored him to touch him. Taking the blind man by the hand, he brought him out to the village and said, "What do you see? Do you see anything?" He looked up and said, "I see men walking around like trees." Then again, he laid his hands on his eyes. He looked, his eyesight is restored. And he said to him, sent him home saying, "Do not even enter the village." Now at this point, Mark doesn't have to put in the text that says, "And the man went all throughout the town." You can probably assume by now, it's not in the text, but you can probably assume Jesus said, "Just go home, don't even go to the village." And this man says, "I'm getting on the first RTA bus downtown. I'm telling all these people what the Lord has done for me." Now, verse 27. The heading you should see is Peter's confession of Christ. Do you all see that? Yes. Did you have a Bible with those kind of headings? Jesus asked around, he says, who do you say that I am? Some said Elijah. Some said other names. And then Peter falls on his knees before him and says, you are the Christ. All right. Now, let's look at this on the literary level of what Mark is doing. He just gave us a story of someone who was blind, receiving sight. And the very next story is someone who gets a revelation of who Jesus is. I tell you what, you want to open up your eyes and see. Sight and revelation is all about knowing who God is. Mark is trying to say, open your eyes, not so you can see what's happening, but so you can know who God is. That's right. Vision allows us to see who he is. You are the Christ, HaMashiach, the anointed one, the one chosen by God. Now the stories begin to get interesting. Somebody in this text, other than demons, has began to break through. Now someone's starting to get the picture. He says, you are the Christ. Now, we know that he's the Son of God. And we could preach about sonship. To me, that's the biggest thing to know. Because if you're a son, you have all your father has. And all your father has is yours. And the fullness of your father can be upon you. But we talk about it another day. They don't know he's the Son of God yet, but he says, you are the Christ. They're getting some. Look at someone and say, he's getting somewhere. Look at someone else and say, he's getting somewhere. He says, you are the Christ. So some light is getting through in this place. Chapter 10. I told you we was going to preach the whole Gospel of Mark. We almost done. Chapter 10, verse 32. I want to highlight just a couple more. A good story adds a lot of drama. Verse 32. The heading says, Jesus' suffering foretold. He says, I'm going to be mocked, spat upon, beaten, crucified, and they're going to kill me. He prophesies what's going to happen. But he says, 3 days later, I'm going to rise again. So now he's setting us up for some drama. The story is getting good now because no one knows who he is yet. We do. And us as viewers are like, Lord, please, before you die, before the main character's off the scene, can someone get a revelation of who he is? Somebody. He'll die in 5 chapters. Someone has to get this before he's dead. Look at someone and say, he is the resurrection. Look at another neighbor and say, I am the resurrection. Now let's go chapter 15, verse 39. And we're going to tie this in with chapter 16, verse 8. Jesus is crucified and he just died. He breathed his last breath. Verse 37 says, and Jesus uttered a loud cry and breathed his last. And the veil of the temple was torn in two from top to bottom. Verse 39, when the centurion who was standing right in front of him saw the way he breathed his last breath, he said, truly, this man was. Now somebody in the story got it. Let me make a side note right here. It's something about the way God's servants and those who love God, it's something about the way death can be a great example as to who you are and who God is. It was at his last breath, the way he died. The centurion got it. Or if we had a couple of Christians who weren't afraid to die, who weren't afraid to give up their life, to be a witness to somebody. Jesus said, no greater love a man had than to lay down his life for a friend. If you love God, what are you willing to let die? Amen. What in your life needs to breathe its last breath right now as a testimony and testament as to how much you love God? And I guarantee you, when you can serve and love God like that, oh, someone will get the revelation. Someone will get the revelation of God. The centurion said, surely this man was the Son of God. So now, centurion knows. Now we have some characters in the story, human being that knows who Jesus is. They acknowledge who Jesus is after his death. Chapter 16, verse 8. We're going to tie this all together. And if those of you all who know how to praise and know how to shout, I'm going to need you in about 5 minutes, because we're going to get to a point where if you feel like it, you can run around this church, because I'm going to talk about some of the goodness of God. 16, verse 8. Start at verse 6. And he said to them, an angel, do not be amazed. You are looking for Jesus the Nazarene, who has been crucified. He has risen. He is not here. Behold, here is the place where they laid him. But go, tell his disciples and Peter, he is going ahead of you to Galilee. There you will see him, just as he told you. Go, tell them he is alive. Verse 8, they went out and fled from the tomb, for trembling and astonishment had gripped them, and they said nothing to anyone, for they were afraid. Close your Bibles. Most scholars believe, or would say, that the Gospel of Mark ended at chapter 16, verse 8.
Come on, preacher.
The rest of those verses, they say, were probably added on later on. I think it might have been because they may have missed what Mark was crafting in his story. The whole time in the story, one thing happens, person goes in the opposite direction. Jesus heals a man, and they go in the opposite direction. He says, stay quiet, and they go get louder. He says, come out of here quietly, and they start screaming and convulsing. He says, go to your home, tell the people what happened. He goes to the biggest city and finds it. So the whole time, characters doing opposite of what the text said.
Yes, sir.
And Mark, being such a wonderful gospel writer, has now pulled us in. We feel this thing. We know this story. We know he's the Son of God. We know who he is. We know he's Jesus. But only one person gets it. He's pulled us into the story.
Yes, sir.
And 16:8 says they were trembling and afraid. And they went home and said nothing. If Mark has done his job well as a gospel writer, the whole time he showed you, every time I go in one direction, I really want you to go into another direction. So he says, guess what? They said nothing. They were quiet. Now, audience, reader, listener, what are you going to do? Are you going to stay quiet? Or are you going to go in the opposite direction and tell everybody about what God has done? Now back to this Roman centurion. Oh, I feel like preaching. Back to this Roman centurion. He says, surely this man was the Son of God. Let me get some water. We about to go somewhere. Come to speak life. Come to speak life. He said, surely this man is the Son of God.
Yes, sir.
The whole time, his identity has been a secret. The whole time, he's kept it quiet. In the movie The Prestige, brother, you can help me. I'm going to explain it to you. They say every good magic trick consists of 3 acts. First, the pledge, where the magician takes something ordinary.
All right.
A Bible, a book. Now, I'm about to do no magic tricks, so don't get out your head. I'm about to do that. Take something ordinary and shows the audience. The second phase is called the pledge. He takes the ordinary and does something extraordinary with it, like making something disappear.
Come on, preacher.
But then the third part of the trick was called the prestige. And he said it's not just good enough to make something disappear, but the audience is waiting. There's a moment, a pause of silence, and the audience is waiting to see what's going to happen.
That's right.
And he said the prestige is when you bring something back that was disappeared. Mark, being the wonderful gospel writer he is, he said, I'm going to show you that Jesus is the Son of God. I'm going to tell you who he is. I'm going to tell you everything about him. Then he said, I'm going to make him disappear. I'm going to kill him. And now the audience is waiting. They're waiting. What's going to happen? We're waiting. They're waiting. What's going to happen?
Come on.
Then he says, but it's not complete unless I bring him back. It's not complete unless it comes back to life. Whatever God is doing in your life, it ain't finished until it comes back to life. At that point, just before they announced the resurrection,
Yes, sir.
Mark got